Finally, I'd like to turn to narrative songs, which help illustrate how a performer can infuse the self they have fashioned into a story shaped by society. Though many of these songs feature bawdy content delivered by characters who are not part of the noble class, they were still written to be enjoyed by nobles, and so they're part of the courtly tradition. Many of them are anonymous in the manuscripts, likely meaning that they were sung by many different people in many different places before they were written down. Each individual singer or storyteller would have brought their own opinions about self and society to these narratives and performed them in personal ways. The songs in this section all feature a feminine character in conversation with a masculine character. What each character says can be construed differently based on the singer's gender presentation, their personal perspectives of self and society, and the interpretive nuances they choose to present in the performance. I begin my final set with a song belonging to a rather nebulous genre of medieval lyric known as the chanson de toile. E. Jane Burns has characterized the feminine characters in this genre as using women's work to renegotiate their place in the fabric of society and fashion a narrative that works in their favor, so it's particularly fitting for me to start here. The heroine in this poem, lovely Yolande, bridges the gap between the lofty lady of Grand Champ and the sexually promiscuous women found in genres such as the pastorelle and Malmarie songs. When her lover enters the room, she is appropriately demure and silent. But as soon as she is given the opportunity, she expresses herself very directly. Our heroine is a noble young lady who wants romantic love and a sexual encounter, speaks up for herself, and gets what she wants in the end. And this is key, she is not condemned for it within the text of the poem. Yolande has the agency to initiate physical contact and then remain an active participant in the foreplay to her off-page sexual encounter. Now, what was acceptable for a feminine character in literature and song was almost certainly more flexible than what was considered appropriate behavior for real medieval women. But Yolande feels like a real person in this song. So I imagine that real women sometimes behaved or desired to behave in ways that transgressed social norms. People are people, after all. But in Medieval Sex Lives, Elizabeth Ava Leach argues that even for people who were making approved choices, songs such as this could have allowed them to experience desire and participate in sexual fantasies in a socially acceptable way. The song seems more earnest than humorous. It would fit stylistically within a longer chivalric romance and should be treated like a story, not a joke. However, the content of the poem is still pretty explicit about what is going on, and thus words like baiser, coucher, and ah, tu, François, can be emphasized and made suggestive using throaty or raspy tones. The various speaking voices should be distinct, and the refrains should be colored using facial expressions, ornaments, and vocal qualities that reflect their shifting significance throughout the piece. And here's where it gets a little ugly. Not every narrative from the medieval period translates so easily into a modern performance. The medieval repertoire is so full of misogyny that it is nearly impossible to avoid. But these narratives are a part of history and should not be ignored. One of the most challenging lyric types in this respect, the pastorelle, is marked by certain stock phrases, characters, and narratives which set modern sensibilities on edge. Take, for example, "On mit la rosée, que n'est la fleur," which follows a typical formula for the genre. A knight encounters a beautiful shepherdess in a secluded grove, asks for her love. She responds, in this case, apparently turning down the knight's advances. The knight then proceeds anyway, and though the language in the fourth stanza seems to imply sexual assault, the shepherdess's final words confuse the narrative. If we look at the surface level, this song describes the knight literally raping the shepherdess after she had explicitly shut him down. In stanza 3, she says, "You will never have me for your folly." Stanza 4 describes the knight's reasoning as he assaults the shepherdess. When I saw that asking would be worth nothing to me, I just laid her on the ground. The knight narrator then claims that she made no protest, but went along enthusiastically. Afterward, the shepherdess's words might seem to confirm this assessment. Oops, there we go. As she invokes Christ and Mary and asks the knight to return often. Such narratives of dubious consent are prevalent in this and other quote-unquote lower style lyric types. Even in this controversial genre, though, there is room for resistant interpretations of the embedded gender roles. The text invites a variety of interpretations, but let us first imagine the piece performed as a beautiful piece of music with no thought given to acting out the narrative. If a masculine voice were to sing this song in that way, the audience might automatically hear the song from the knight's perspective. He sees a beautiful girl who draws him in and asks politely for her love. He hears her refusal, but reads it as flirtatious. She knows what he's really asking for because she calls it out as his folly. So he goes for it anyway, and she has a great time, so good, in fact, that she begs him to come back for her. If we believe the narrator implicitly, this seems straightforward, but is likely not the perspective, not the message a modern performer would want to impart. Things get immediately more complicated when a feminine voice sings the song without thought to narrative. An audience of this performance might identify more with the shepherdess. But does she mean what she says or not? If the feminine performer is not giving any audible or visible interpretive context, the implications of the story are ambiguous and questionable. Either singer must make choices that help tell a coherent story from their own perspective. On the most basic level, there are three ways to tell the story. Either the woman changes her mind, or she's secretly a willing participant the whole time, or she is the victim of a violent rape. Certainly, medieval sensibilities allow for the first two interpretations. Sermons and stories warn of the mutability of the feminine nature and the seductive powers of their bodies. The shepherdess's fickle behavior could even be played for laughs, reinforcing medieval stereotypes. If she is instead a willing participant, she regains some power that might have been stripped from her by her culture, even in a scenario that we would find awful today. Extramarital sex was frowned upon in medieval society, and indeed still is in many circles, by initially declining the knight's advances verbally, but physically implying flirtation. One could play the shepherdess as maintaining a veneer of propriety that would allow plausible deniability if she's publicly shamed for her illicit sexual activity. I argue that there is enough evidence in the text to have allowed for this third version of the story. And this interpretation hinges on the juxtaposition between the quote, son of Holy Mary in stanza 3, and the quote, son of Lady Mary in stanza 3, and the son of Holy Mary in stanza 5, as well as the double meaning of the word commend. To a medieval person, the physical world had eternal metaphysical ramifications. In stanza 3, the shepherdess is talking of earthly things, and in stanza 5, she evokes the heavenly. If the last stanza is sung in a genuine manner, the shepherdess's commendation takes on the meaning of recommend, and she is equating the sexual act to something divine. If the last stanza instead takes on a bitter or ironic quality, the commendation shifts to mean something more like entrust, implying that the shepherdess is turning the knight over to Christ to receive the consequences for his actions. By my performance, I aim to apply my own resistant reading to the text of this song, turning it into a condemnation of sexual assault. To illustrate that my shepherdess is not a willing participant in her sexual encounter, I draw attention to the fact that her speeches in stanzas 3 and 5 both resist the structure of the melody in a way that the other stanzas do not. I follow the flow of language in the shepherdess's speeches by not pausing at the ends of the melodic sections, but in the other stanzas, I clearly separate the ABB segments, as suggested by the text. I treat the girl's refusal as genuine by singing it with a serious facial expression, then brightening my tone, singing with a smile when she begins to describe Robin. Her outcry in stanza 5, by contrast, takes on the implication of lamenting and cursing rather than a cry of delight by using an ugly, non-musical tone and consonants harsh enough to seem like hissing and spitting. In my interpretation, she only wants the knight to return to pay for the honor he took from her. I color my performance of the knight's speech to illustrate my perception that he is in the wrong. Stanza 2 should come across as creepy when I make "Blessed be the Master" sound prayer-like. I've asked my instrumentalist to foreshadow the assault by playing with a sinister affect under the knight's direct address to the demoiselle. I heighten the violence in stanza 4 by bringing out k and t sounds to imply force and lengthening sh fricatives to imitate lusty breathing. The accompaniment reflects my choices using agitated movement and lots of dissonance. In the final stanza, I sing the lines of narration quickly and dismissively to cement the knight's bad character. But then I'm going to give you a bit of respite after that, I promise. The final song in my recital has another common trope from medieval song literature, that of the mal mariée, or the unhappy wife. This one is told through the eyes of a man out riding in the countryside near Paris. Je Chevauchouet Lautrec presents a humorous take on a bad situation. The female character removes some power from her abusive husband by making him something to be laughed at. She chooses to follow her own desire despite the physical abuse it brings her. Regardless of her agency, however, the song still reads as a sexual fantasy within a male gaze, as the lady happily transgresses social norms at a mere request from the narrator. Notably, the song only shows the plan and not the actual action of adultery, making for a quote-unquote safer resistance from the mores of society. But the use of male gaze is further marked by the stereotypical representation of the Dame de Paris as an embodied and sexualized character whose complaints are expressed through a repeated refrain and a sing-song melody made of small recurring motives. Although we might still consider the feminine stereotype, the use of male gaze, and the adultery narrative problematic, this song is much less ambiguous in tone than Ami la Rosée, and thus easier to interpret in the spirit of fun and sexual liberation that it likely implied to its medieval audiences. To highlight the humor of this poem, I'm choosing to lean into the sing-song repetitive nature of the music by rhythmicizing the melody. The story has a lot of room for dramatization through differentiating the voices of the speaking characters, playing with rhythm to highlight important words, and varying instrumental accompaniment. And with that,